In recent years, one of the cleverest tricks for slandering any new religious movement has been to accuse them of kidnapping people, especially if it can be implied that the people being kidnapped really are kids. One of the first groups that this strategy was used on, and with great success, included Friends of A Voice in the Desert. It's a long story, but quite an interesting one. In July 2000, a 15-year-old boy met some of Voice's friends in a shopping mall in England. He was enthralled with their talk of living by faith and working for Jesus, and wanted to join them. They explained that he was far too young, but said that if he had parental permission, since it was school holidays, he could travel around with them, including a 2-week outreach to Germany coming up in a couple of weeks. The boy, Bobby, said that his grandmother was his legal guardian, and he invited his new friends to come and meet her. The grandmother was thrilled to hear of Bobby's interest because, she said, he had been hiding in his room and showing very little interest in doing anything. She agreed to let Bobby come with them, and filled in papers for him to get a passport for the trip to the continent. While they waited for the papers to be processed, Bobby phoned his grandmother every night and dropped in to have a meal with her twice a week. However, the youth leader at Bobby's church heard about Bobby's new friends, and he contacted a professional cult buster. The two of them went to the grandmother and quizzed her about what was happening. They guaranteed her that if he ever left the country, she would never see him again, and that the only chance of him being rescued was for her to do 2 things. 1, she must not breathe a word of this to Bobby. She must pretend that everything was fine. And 2, she must sign papers making Bobby a ward of the state, so that they could use social services to rescue her grandson. The woman naively agreed to both requests. So when Bobby turned up, while the 2 men were still there in her apartment, she went down to meet him and one of his new friends in the entrance to the apartment block, telling him that she could not let them in the house. They reported later that she was unusually nervous, almost in tears. A day or 2 later, they received a frantic phone call from a friend, asking if they had read the headlines. It was all over the papers that the group had kidnapped the boy, including lurid reports of horrible atrocities committed by other groups, implying that these people would do the same thing if they were not stopped immediately. Photos of a 12-year-old Bobby were also published to give the impression that he was much younger than he really was. It later transpired that the cult buster himself was paid thousands of dollars for actually writing the reports. This is a significant factor in how the strategy has worked over the years. Newspaper reports, written by the cult busters themselves, say that cult busters have claimed that the group is a dangerous cult, brainwashes people, etc. And then the cult busting websites add their own newspaper reports to their own websites, citing them as evidence that the group has been reported in the media as being a dangerous cult, practicing brainwashing, etc. After some quick checks by Bobby's new friends, it was established that going back to his grandmother was not an option. Bobby was to be taken into custody by the police and handed over to professional deprogrammers who guaranteed that they would be able to turn him against his new friends, who had already been judged by the cult busters and the media as having been kidnappers and brainwashers, and probably a sex cult. Obviously, Bobby had not been kidnapped, and because going home was now out of the question, they asked him what he wanted to do. He said that he did not want to go into a foster home, and he wanted to make it known that he'd not been kidnapped, even if he was going to have to turn himself in eventually. So the media were contacted, and Bobby agreed to do a number of phone interviews, using various public phone boxes. A couple of the interviews were broadcast before the cult buster and his Church of England youth leader accomplice convinced the courts that the media needed to be gagged. The ABC fought the injunction, but it was 10 days before it was overturned, and by that time Bobby had been located, staying at a holiday camp with 2 of his friends. The charges of kidnapping were, of course, dropped. Bobby's grandmother died begging him for forgiveness for having let herself get tricked by the cult busters, and to this day he hates the cult busters with a passion. When he was finally able to make his own choice, he resumed contact with his friends and remains a personal friend of 2 of them to this day. Nevertheless, the cult busters had achieved the first step in a more elaborate plan. 5 years later, in July 2005, a 27-year-old mother, Betty, decided to step out in faith and work with some friends of A Voice in the Desert who were living in Kenya. Her very wealthy father contacted cultbusters before reporting to local police that his daughter and her son had been kidnapped. Despite the fact that Betty was far from being a child, this time the father had the added information that these were the same people who had been accused of kidnapping someone in England 5 years earlier. Police were bribed, and then a real kidnapping took place. One of Betty's new friends was snatched by the police and held secretly, without charge, in an attempt to get him to reveal Betty's location. Betty herself, a news journalist before joining the group, made her own video declaring that she'd not been kidnapped, but it did not deter the police. A letter-writing campaign by Voice's friends in several different continents succeeded in getting diplomatic pressure put on the authorities in Kenya until the friend's whereabouts was revealed. Charges were officially laid and he was allowed visitors. While in jail, he contracted TB and was ill-treated. The charges, once again, were dropped when Betty appeared at the hearing, despite risks of being kidnapped by her father, whose main goal was to wrest his grandson from her care. Nevertheless, by now a pattern had been established. The group was actively being labelled as kidnappers by cultbusters. Then, the following year, Joe, one of the country's top high school basketball players, who'd been offered a scholarship to Yale University, decided to turn his back on it all to become a missionary. He'd been inspired by reading a book written by Voice, and he made contact with some of Voice's friends in California. He left home at the age of 18, and his parents contacted cultbusters. They too were advised to report that their son had been kidnapped, even though he had left a note letting them know of his decision. Joe turned himself in at a police station in another state, and the matter was dropped as far as the police were concerned. Nevertheless, his parents hired an armed nightclub bouncer to stand guard at the house in case he should return in the company of other Christians, so that he could be forcibly taken away from them. Joe feared problems, but chose to face his parents in the morning, about the time they would be getting up for breakfast, and was fortunate in that it was before the security guard had arrived for the day. Nevertheless, Joe's older brother, a bouncer himself, and his father attacked Joe's friend. They knocked him unconscious and then proceeded to kick him in the face, the head, and body in an attempt to kill him. A passerby filmed the attack, and when they realised they were on film, they retreated into the house, allowing the public to call an ambulance. Voice's friend was in intensive care for a while, with bleeding on the brain, and still suffers from some permanent brain damage as a result of the attack. The phone video was given to the police as evidence of the attack, but when police were told that the man being attacked was part of a dangerous cult with a history of kidnapping people, they conveniently lost the evidence and requested that the judge let the family off, more or less with a warning. For more information on this, see the video on the whipping trial, also on this channel. The video of the attack can be viewed here. To learn more about what A Voice in the Desert actually teaches, please click on the link at the end of this video. Thank you for listening.